Welcome back to the Empire State Sports Report. I'm your host, Adrianna, and today I am joined by Joe DeLeone. I'm so excited to have him because he is an NFL draft and college football analyst for A to Z Sports, and he's also a Giants fan. So we can just commiserate together about these Giants. Welcome.
Appreciate you having me. And yes, it's always fun to talk about the Giants with other Giants fans, but at the same time, there's always just a very depressing tone. I'm hoping that the draft is handled appropriately and that we can feel a little bit more optimistic. But past couple of years, it's been a little hard to be optimistic.
Yeah, it's been tough too because I, for the most part, have liked what they've done in free agency after the last couple of years. So that's excited me. And for the draft, it's mostly been okay. And then the season starts and I'm just like, this is not what I expected.
Well, I think the biggest driving force in all this it's been Daniel Jones. We don't need to beat around the bush. We don't need to try to read into anything else. Them paying Daniel Jones the massive contract that they did and committing so much around him and building around him, not bringing back Saquon. Like, we could go down the litany of just small things and also big things that led to this point. The fact there wasn't an early investment in a different quarterback is brought us here. And hopefully quarterback gets addressed in the draft, and hopefully whoever they take ends up being some sort of franchise changer or just someone who sets them in the right direction that provides steadiness compared to the ups and downs that Daniel Jones gave us as Giants fans.
Definitely. So with that being said, I want to hear your thoughts on Shedeur and if you think they should take him at 3.
I think that the conversation about Shedeur has two sides to it. If we're talking about in a vacuum for the Giants' needs at the current moment, I say no. I think that it doesn't make sense. I think that they need to continue to bolster their offense, round out their defense. There's a bunch of just individual holes where in this draft class, there are premier players that could go on to be all pros for consistent periods of time. Abdul Carter, Mason Graham, Travis Hunter. I think Will Johnson is somebody who needs to be talked about more in that conversation as well. But the issue, we have to talk about it with the context of the desperation of Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll. They are on their last legs. John Mara has made that very clear that they need to show some sort of sign of improvement, that this is turning in the right direction. The desperation is shown by signing 2 contingency plan quarterbacks. They signed Jameis Winston and Russell Wilson in a seemingly panicked state. It was not a move that felt like it was done in confidence, that they believed Russell Wilson or Jameis was the missing piece in order for this team with a great defense to compete. No, it felt like they were worried at number 3 that they were going to be out of the running out of any of the top 2 quarterbacks, and they had to do whatever they could to have competent play at quarterback this upcoming season, unlike what they saw at the end of last year after they got rid of Daniel Jones. I think with that in mind, though, I'd be satisfied with Shedeur Sanders because he is a very high floor player. I think that he could have a similar impact to what Sam Darnold or Jared Goff had this past year, or Geno Smith in his season 2 years ago with the Seattle Seahawks, where he was a great starter. All of those guys did enough. They weren't the driving significant force to their success. The driving force was coaching and a well-rounded roster around those quarterbacks. As long as the Giants, as they did in free agency, with the rest of this draft, put an attention to detail to rounding out their offense around Shedeur Sanders, I'm fine with the pick because it raises the floor significantly of the offense.
Mm-hmm. My thought process with the quarterback this year is because they signed Jameis and Russell and they re-signed Tommy DeVito, the other 2 teams, specifically the Titans and the Browns, neither of them have 3 quarterbacks on their roster. So my thought process is the Giants already have all these quarterbacks, which they didn't have to do. I understand, like you said, they probably did it from more of a protection standpoint if Shedeur doesn't get to them at 3. So I guess we'll have to see how the draft goes. But my thought process is, what's your plan for Shedeur if you're taking him at 3? Is it Tommy DeVito's on the practice squad, which I could see, but then the theory is that he's the 3rd string quarterback? Are him and Jameis Winston battling it out for the 2nd? Daboll talked about, I thought this was hysterical, that last week at the owners' meetings, he was asked what he was liked about Russ Wilson, and he talked about the fact that he takes care of the ball. And I just was like, no one asked him about, as a follow-up, like, your backup quarterback is Jameis Winston? So I don't, maybe that is the thought process. If that you get Shedeur, he's going to be attempting to be the backup? What do you think their plan is if they draft him?
Well, I think if you do take Shedeur, because of these two contingency plans that they've created, it allows for patience. It doesn't force the Giants to rush out Shedeur Sanders immediately, which I think is the right approach. Mm-hmm. Russell Wilson is a competent enough of a starter that he can go out there, he can play the entire season, or he can at least play like 12 games, and they can stay competitive. They can stay in all these ball games to just put a quality product out there in the field, give the Giants fans hopes. But I guess that with Shedeur's sake, that, yeah, he would be competing for that backup quarterback role. And then eventually, once they're out of playoff contention, starting Shedeur Sanders. And I also wouldn't be shocked if this wouldn't have a similar, path to what happened with Michael Penix this past year, where he was drafted. Kirk Cousins started most of the year. He looked good at the beginning, got banged up. And then once the wheels fell off for the Falcons, he eventually gets benched in favor of Michael Penix. And then they just let Michael Penix go out there, make plays, look young and exciting, allow for the fan base to get juiced up, thinking like, wow, like look what we could be in 2 years with Michael Penix building chemistry with all these guys. So I think that would generally be the approach. If you're drafting him that early, maybe you have this advantage here. Maybe you could end up trading Jameis Winston to somebody after the preseason if you feel good about Shedeur and where he stands, to somebody who's looking for a quality backup or a spot starter that's not satisfied with their current quarterback room or that suffers a significant injury.
With that being said, let's stay on quarterbacks for a second, because let's say they go best player available, which I think most Giants fans would probably be thrilled with, whether it's Hunter or Carter. What do you think is the best move for them at quarterback next? Do you think it's worth trading into the first for Jackson Dart? Do you wait for a Jalen Milroe? Or do you just punt all the way to Will Howard, or say, forget it, we'll get one next year? Knowing that in theory, the 2026 draft class is supposed to be better than this one, a little more depth, talent, etc.
I first of all, out on Jackson Dart. I don't think that it is worth trading into the first round for Jackson Dart. I'd maybe consider doing it if he was on the board in the second round where the Giants were picking. I would think it through. But my problem with Jackson Dart is that his performance and his film masks a lot of underlying issues with him. He's got good accuracy. He has just really great poise in the pocket. He's an underrated athlete. He moves pretty well. But his arm isn't strong enough to like really challenge defenses and attack tight windows. He's got good deep ball accuracy, but when we talk about what arm strength provides, is that when there's like a really tight window that a defense has played really great coverage, pressure's bearing down, the ball just gets out super quick, is delivered to a receiver way quicker than most quarterbacks in the league. That is why we covet those traits when we talk about a guy like Cam Ward as the number one prospect in this class, because he can do that. Jackson Dart is below average in that category, and I think that leads to incompletions. I think it leads to him misfiring and throwing behind his receivers. But most importantly, I have a lot of issues with him making that second read, moving on to that second read. I don't think he's very good at that, and I think that that's a problem and a learning curve for him. He keeps getting billed as this guy who can step in and start right away, and I think it's the furthest thing from the truth playing in that Lane Kiffin offense. If I were the Giants and I was still looking for a quarterback to have in the mix, I would take Jalen Milroe somewhere in the second or third round. I don't know if I would do it at the very beginning of the second round, because again, I'd like to just keep building the roster and addressing and taking advantage of all the defensive prospects in the class. But Jalen Milroe at least has really high upside. You bench him for 3 years. You let him learn. You let him sit on as the third quarterback on this roster. And he's a premier athlete with a big arm that maybe he pans out. And if not, you just move on to next year and you draft somebody.
Yeah, I get the feeling that Dable might be the perfect coach for someone like Milroe, who can eventually bring out the best in him. They have the Alabama connection. I'm curious how much that would come into play. But I think that Dable likes some of the traits that he has. You know, there's been a lot of comparisons of his athleticism with Lamar Jackson. So I think things like that make me feel like Dable would really love him. But all right. I know quarterbacks is going to be the big topic, but the Giants have a lot of holes. So I want to hear your thoughts on Will Compton, because I know you've just said that he needs to be talked about more. Do you think he should be talked about more for the Giants at 3, or not that high?
I think that third overall for Will Johnson, I think would be a little bit too high for me, just because he's a cornerback. But if theoretically the Giants traded back and they moved out of that spot, and maybe I know that there's a little bit of buzz for the Patriots to try and swap picks and move up. That wouldn't be enough for me to still take Will Johnson that early. But I think that if the Giants are moving back and somebody else really badly wants to get up there to take Abdul Carter, taking him somewhere in the first round is absolutely a great pick. I would take him anywhere in the top 10. I think that he has such rare instincts for a cornerback, and his length and his ability to use his length to win in tight contested areas is something that's very hard to come by in cornerback prospects. I don't understand why there's been this weird recent slide for him for projections by a lot of NFL draft analysts. It might be because of the injury that he suffered at the end of the year. It might just be the general overthink that we get to this late in the process with really good prospects. But he is somebody that I would be very satisfied if the Giants selected at some point, even if it did happen to be a lot earlier than expected and was that third overall pick.
Yeah. I think I got him confused. Isn't there a Will Compton who's also supposed to be like a top 10 pick? Maybe I'm getting the name.
Will Campbell? Is that who you're talking about?
Campbell, maybe that's
sorry about that.
He's offensive lineman.
Yes, he's the LSU offensive lineman.
Okay, so let's talk about offensive line for a second, because I was at the Senior Bowl, so I got to see a lot of guys up close, which was great. Gray Zabel looked fantastic, so I know he's a guy that has been talked about a lot. The Alabama player, Booker, I believe, is someone who else has been talked about a lot. So who do you have as your top two guards and top two tackles? Because I think those are going to be where the Giants would go in the draft.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of Josh Simmons. He's my number one tackle right now, the Ohio State offensive lineman. He's coming off of an injury, so there's a chance the Giants could end up lucking out and he slides to somewhere in the second round. But he's got some of the best tape, best fluidity, best anchor, just really solid, fluid moving tackle prospect that if out of anybody, I have no question marks on if he's going to work in the NFL, because he just plugs right in and does everything that you look for. I'm also a really big Kelvin Banks fan. I think that he's got the power and the feet in order to be a successful either guard or tackle in the NFL. At the same time, I think that Will Campbell comes into this conversation that he can play guard or he can play tackle depending on a team's need. And I think the Giants sitting at third overall, it would be a little bit early for me, but I wouldn't be dissatisfied with taking Will Campbell that early, because it allows for you to almost shuffle around depending on where you want to deploy Evan Neal. And if you feel comfortable with him at tackle again this year, if you want to move him back to guard and test him out at guard, and then allow Will Campbell to play that right tackle spot or vice versa. In terms of the guards, though, I do really, really like Tyler Booker. Tyler Booker has some of the best tape in this class. He is a bull in a china shop. He is fantastic in a phone booth, and he has been lauded as having some of the highest character of any lineman in this class by a lot of his coaches and his teammates. And then the last guy I'd like to bring up, Armand Membu, who comes from Missouri, had the best combine testing performance. He flies to the second level. He's got great length. And another player who, depending on your team's needs, could slot in at guard, or he can end up bumping out to right tackle.
Okay. I love that a lot of these guys seem to have some flexibility, because the Giants have said supposedly they're moving Evan Neal to guard, but we know Illuminor has some flexibility there. So I'm curious to see what they end up doing and where they would go with whoever they bring in the draft. So I think the offensive line is going to be interesting, but let's talk about defensive line, because this is a really big defensive tackle class, and I've heard a lot of names thrown around that's who the Giants should be prioritizing at 34. When it comes to the Giants, where do you think their best bet for a defensive tackle is, and who are a couple guys that you love?
Yeah, considering that right now that you've got the big body monster that is Dexter Lawrence, I think that the Giants' priority should be trying to go after somebody who's maybe a little bit more compact to play opposite of that body type. You're not going to be drafting somebody to back up Dexter Lawrence in this circumstance if you're drafting him at the beginning of the second round. But two guys that I like for that conversation are either Derek Harmon from Oregon, who I don't think is going to be on the board, but there's certainly a possibility, who's tall, who's long. He's got very underrated flexibility and plays a great pad level despite being on the taller side. Was one of the most successful defensive tackles this year in terms of generating pressures. And because of his build, he can play so many different roles. He can play as a 0 tech, he plays a 5 tech, he can play as a 1 tech in a defense, depending on the front. And then the other is Darius Alexander from Toledo, who's a little bit of an older prospect, dominated at the Senior Bowl, was a kick-ass player in the one-on-ones, was unblockable in those pass rush situations. And if you put on his tape, the whole entire MAC conference had no idea how to block him. And I think the best part about his film is that he has a pick 6 from the bowl game, which I implore anybody to go look up. Yeah. Oh, he can move, he can fly. And I think that he deserves more recognition and would be a great pick for the Giants there.
That's amazing. This is the stuff that gets me really excited about the draft, because you start seeing and hearing all those things, and there's like all these possibilities now of like where these guys could end up going. I also want to talk about the running backs and the Giants running back room, because I definitely think there's some question marks there. I think that, I don't really know what the future is with Eric Gray, and we know that this is also a deep running back draft. If you're the Giants, would you take a swing on one in later rounds? And are there any that you think might be like, a lot of people said that Tyrone Tracy was a really good steal. So anyone that you think might stand out like that in a later round?
I think it's imperative that the Giants do draft another running back. I'm not really impressed by Eric Gray. I think that they need to bring somebody in that is of equal value of Tyrone Tracy. And I'd actually go as far as to say if the Giants feel comfortable with a guy on day 2 that they really like, drafting another running back that early isn't a problem. In the NFL these days, it's great having multiple good running backs, especially knowing that the Giants have had so many issues consistently running the football since Saquon left. And I know Tracy showed a lot of value and improvement throughout the final stretch of the year. It would be great to have another dynamic guy. And guys I would consider, though, somewhere on day 3, I'm a big fan of RJ Harvey from UCF, very compact, powerful, and explosive guy. He tested very, very well. I also really like a guy like Caleb Johnson from Iowa, who could go somewhere in 3rd, 4th round, who's got really great vision and patience. Devin Neal from Kansas is another guy who's a fluid runner, who's super, super patient and knows how to always find that secondary lane when things start to open up. And then the last guy late on day 3 that is worth considering that anyone from New Jersey knows about, Kyle Monangai from Rutgers, is a player that I love, that I think presents a lot of really underrated value. I think he is going to be this year's Bucky Irving or Kyron Williams, because he does everything right. He is a kick-ass pass blocker. He is going to do the nitty-gritty short area things, and he's going to earn a lot of early snaps just because he does all of those things right. And then eventually it'll translate to him getting more and more touches and him creating production despite him not having great testing numbers.
Yeah, and he's one of the players who, when the Giants did their local pro day a couple days ago, he was one of the guys that was brought in. So they are doing their research on some of those local guys. I want to talk about Jalin Hyatt for a second, because I'm curious if you watched his tape back in college and what you thought about the pick at the time versus what you think the plan is with him now.
I did watch his tape, and I was very excited about that pick when the Giants got him, because I was like really hoping that, like, wow, this is going to be a guy that is going to just be a huge seam threat. He's going to be a huge threat over the top and is going to cause a lot of problems for opposing defenses. And I think that it's been a nightmare situation for 2 reasons for Hyatt. One, incompetent quarterback play, which we talked about at the beginning here. I just feel like Daniel Jones wasn't good about finding him. I also don't think that the Rant Drew Lock and Thibodeaux weren't going to find him and create big plays. But it also stinks that he didn't have the development that we've been hoping for. He's kind of stagnated. He stayed the same since he came out of Tennessee. It's really hard for a young guy like that needed development and needed creative deployment to not be around a veteran quarterback that isn't going to help set him up to succeed. So I think that he's been in such a difficult spot. It wouldn't hurt for the Giants to look on day 2 to maybe draft another receiver to challenge that role. The biggest problem, and I think that Giants fans need to understand, any receiver that is taken on day 3, this is a very weak receiver class. It is a very shallow receiver class. Anyone who's taken on day 3 is not going to challenge Jalin Hyatt for that starting job. There's a chance that they could, but I find it very, very unlikely.
Okay. If they don't get Hunter at 3, what do you think about someone like Egbuka at 34? Do you think it's not worth taking a wide receiver that high? I think obviously if they get Travis Hunter, I think the wide receiver is likely to be out of the equation, or someone who's going to be later on in the draft. But I think if they don't get Hunter, I'm curious if there's Egbuka or someone like him that might be a good fit.
Yeah, I don't think that Ibuka's body type and role plays well for what the Giants need right now at receiver. I actually think that Jaden Higgins from Iowa State would be a much better pick, and that would be worthy of going there at 34. He's a tall, long guy, another player who had really good testing numbers and had really great college production alongside his teammate Jalen Knoll, who's going to be equally as highly drafted. Right now, the Giants don't really have that tall, big body, possession guy that's a smooth route runner. They just don't have that true X. Malik Neighbors is awesome, but they need somebody that they can have play off of the more compact body type that Neighbors brings to the position. I don't think that Higgins steps in and is an 1,000-yard receiver like Neighbors is, or takes any touches away from him. But I think that he would play very nicely having somebody taller that's a different, longer, slender body type that allows for different route combinations and different concepts in order to get him the football. And more importantly, I know that Darius Slayton just got the extension and he kind of fits that descriptor, but they need somebody better than Darius Slayton to play that role at the current moment.
Yeah, I think just to have some competition in there would be nice. Even
yeah.
Like, I love Wandale, but sometimes I'm like, can we just have someone else in the slot just for one play? Let me just see what else we can get, especially if it's going to be a 3rd and 7 and you throw a 5-yard pass. Like maybe throw it to someone who's a little bit bigger. I don't know, just a thought there. I want to go back to Travis Hunter for a second too and hear your thoughts on, if you're the Giants and you take Hunter, what is your best plan for him?
I think that the best plan for any team who takes him, but this definitely applies to the Giants and their current needs. I think he is best suited as a cornerback because it is so hard to find one really elite cornerbacks like what he could become. He has insane instincts. His ball skills would already be some of the best in the NFL because he knows how to play receiver and has the hands of a receiver. And he just has the fluid, easy hips in order to transition and make plays on the ball really easy, play really good sticky coverage. I would want him at corner. He would be an eventual All-Pro if he pans out, and then just work him in occasionally as a rotational receiver. Just work him in every few series. Don't start him too much. Don't get him banged up. Don't tire him out. I know that he wants to play so much, but it's just so unrealistic that he's going to be able to learn enough, having to split time between meetings, and then also just physically deal with the wear and tear of playing both sides of the football. But a lot of people keep putting this out there. He is the reincarnation of Odell Beckham Jr. And I know some Giants fans maybe don't get excited about that statement, but I would be knowing if Odell stuck around and he didn't turn into as much of a head case as he was at the end of his time with the Giants. I'd be more than happy with a new version of that who's playing, every so often on a couple of series a game.
Yeah. And I think if you're Russ Wilson, Jameis Winston, or even us as fans, like the thought of having Neighbors and Hunter on the field together, I agree. I don't think it's going to be every snap, but I think if you bring him in 3rd down, red zone, like there's certain instances that you bring him in, how could you not be excited about that? I think that, if you don't go Shedeur at 3, I think that type of pick is the type that really gets the fan base excited about this upcoming season and, the future too.
Right. That's my whole big point with this, and it goes back to the beginning conversation that we had of like, in a vacuum, like what's the smartest thing to do? In a vacuum, Travis Hunter is the smartest pick. I don't think that Abdul Carter makes a lot of sense for the Giants' needs because they've got Kayvon Thibodeaux, they have Brian Burns, unless they have an intention to trade Kayvon Thibodeaux during the draft or after the draft. Abdul Carter is worthy of the conversation of being the best prospect in the class. It just doesn't fit the Giants' needs. But if you bring in Travis Hunter, not only is he going to be your best starting outside corner opposite of Deonte Banks, and also a really good second receiver who plays every so often in important situations, but he's also an amazing young man who I think would be perfect for a market like this, where his personality is only going to grow and his brand is only going to grow even more. He is just an infectious individual who I think that draws a lot of positive attention. And right now, the Giants could use as much positive attention as they can get.
Yes, they could. With that being said, I noticed that you said Banks and Hunter versus Thibodeaux. So I'm curious your thoughts on Thibodeaux, if you think it was a good pickup from what you know and have seen of him, and your thoughts on starting Hunter over him versus starting Banks. Because I know a lot of Giants fans are like, I'm done with Banks, but I think it's too early to say we're done with Banks. I think he just maybe had a sophomore slump. I think hopefully he's going to figure it out. I think Shane Bowen is also a big part of the problem. But I'm curious on that.
Well, I think that what it allows you now, if you do take Hunter, it allows you to shuffle the roles on this defense. Dory Jackson's gone. I know that he had a role playing in the nickel at times and towards the end of his time with the Giants. I think that allows for you to determine, do we move Banks inside? And in the modern NFL, having a good nickel corner is really important. So I'd feel pretty comfortable with that. I think that is what this now creates. Adebo is better suited outside. I'm not starting Adebo in the slot, nor am I starting Travis Hunter in the slot. They're just too tall and long for it to make a lot of sense for them to be playing those roles. But it wouldn't be so much a benching. It would just be a shuffling of responsibilities. And maybe in a more close quarters scenario, that would allow for Banks to play better and to use his speed and his quickness to attack smaller, more compact slot receivers. So I think that would create one of the most underrated secondaries in the NFL if you were able to have Travis Hunter, Paulson Adebo, and Deonte Banks and just deploy them to stick with receivers that their play styles and body types will allow them to succeed in.
Yeah. And I like the moves that they made this offseason for the secondary. But one of the guys that I really loved that stuck out to me at the Senior Bowl was Quincy Riley. And I'm not so sure he's going to make it to the Giants, but where do you think he's going to go in the draft? And is there any chance that the Giants get him?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Quincy Riley. I think that he's realistically an early day 3 pick. He is, if the scenario that we just talked about with corners doesn't come to fruition, they don't take Travis Hunter. He is the ideal prototype for a slot corner because he's a great tackler. He's physical. He doesn't have the requisite length that we look for in outside corners. So he's not going to really win in those one-on-one situations often with taller, shiftier receivers that are playing on the outside. But over the middle, I know that he's going to have an impact against the run. And I also know that he is going to scrap it out and do some great things in those contested spots with slot receivers. So I'm a big fan of Quincy Riley. I think that he's put together some great film and has been a really underrated name through this process.
Yeah, I feel like he's not been mentioned a lot. And, from what I saw at the Senior Bowl, I was impressed with him. So I've been curious to see kind of where the consensus is of where he's going to fall. But all right, I've got 2 more questions with you because I know you have experience in the betting industry. So I want to talk about that for a minute. So I've seen that the over-under for the Giants is 5.5 wins. What are you taking?
I'm going to take over on this and hear me out. And this is my total negativity playing into this. I just know the way that they approach free agency, and let's just say Russell Wilson starts every single game. They're going to win a bunch of games that they're not supposed to, just like they did this year. Mm-hmm. Dayball and Shane are trying to buy themselves time. They're probably still going to get fired at the end of the year. They're going to win 6 games, and the Giants are going to be picking 4th or 5th overall this upcoming season. It is just the inevitability. We can't get out of our own way. So for just that simple reason, knowing that the Giants will find a way to blow this, I think that there's certainly a case for them to win 6.
I think the same thing. And my concern is actually that if things go better than expected, they could win 7 to 8. And then, then we have the 7th pick and we're for the 3rd year in a row, we're not getting a quarterback. So that would not surprise me.
Which would be brutal.
Yeah, it would just be classic. All right. So lastly, if you had to bet on it, who do you think the Giants pick at 3?
I would bet on, I think that the most likely is going to be Shedeur Sanders. I think for a lot of the things that we discussed here is that the current situation is that they need to have some sort of optimism for the fan base, for Mara to feel like things are turning in the right direction. They need to have something. And I think that them taking Shedeur Sanders at least answers that question a little bit. Mm-hmm. There's always the capability for them to trade up to 2. There's a capability for them to sit there and Travis Hunter goes 2nd overall. I think with all these different variables that Shedeur Sanders just makes the most sense. Outside of that, the next most likely makes sense is Travis Hunter. If they decide that they don't want to go quarterback, they don't want to force it, Hunter fits multiple needs for them and they would have an instant superstar playmaker.
Yeah, I think those are the top 2 most likely. Do you think there's any chance they trade out of that spot and move back?
If Shedeur Sanders isn't on the board, I think that they would consider it. I think that there could certainly be a team that gets really excited that Abdul Carter's still on the board at 3. And if somebody's willing to mortgage their future, the Giants should absolutely take that deal.
Yeah, they could use more first rounders, especially for next year.
Exactly.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Tell everyone where they can find you.
Yeah, you can catch me on X at Joe DeLeone. Be sure to check out the A to Z Sports Film Room channel on YouTube where we do individual scouting reports and we're doing all of our player rankings right now. And then be sure to check out Ruffino and Joe Show, which is my college football podcast that I do with my co-host, Blake Ruffino. It was great getting to catch up with you, and I'm very excited to see what the Giants do in the draft.
Me too. It's coming up soon. Thank you so much.